So you use things like saying that you're carbon neutral, which quite frankly, we need to stop doing because nothing can actually, by definition, be carbon neutral. Considering that everything around us exists of carbon atoms, nothing can be carbon zero or carbon neutral. Yeah, so looking at these buzzwords, eco-friendly, green, pro-planet, all of those, just using those words without any substantiated action that can be traced to you actually measuring and reporting on your environmental sustainability initiatives, that is greenwashing. So,
Josie Traberg, welcome to the Sports Management Podcast.
thanks so much for having me, Marcus. It's really exciting to be here today.
It's my pleasure to have you on. And first time I heard about you, we were on a panel together at my former university. We talked about the communication and marketing with regards to sustainability. And for those who don't know you, you're a college athlete turning PhD student, a social activist, fitness professional. So can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, that's a handful. I have many titles and I wear many hats, and I take lots of pride in that. I've been playing basketball my whole life at a high level, both college basketball in the US, played in the Bucks and WBBL in the UK, and also in the highest professional series here in Norway, which is where I currently live. I'm born and raised in Norway, but the American accent gives it away that I spent many years in the US. I was there for 10 years. Originally just to do an exchange year and study, and that turned into 10 years of playing basketball and studying. Have my bachelor's degrees from Regis University in the US, in Regis is in Colorado and Denver, in peace and justice studies and international development work, and then segue into a master's in sports coaching. Worked as a strength and conditioning coach for many years in the US and was very invested and worked heavily in the sports industry there in the performance part of it. So working with athletes to get stronger, faster, and jump higher and those things. Stuck with that for many years, but then started to shift over into the sports management sphere and have a second master's from Loughborough University. And it's a mouthful. It's in sports management, international politics and development. I might have butchered that, so apologize to Loughborough and Richard Giulianotti, who's the lead program director there. But a great master's program. Really big shout out to Loughborough for that. So anyone interested in sports management and not sure where to go, big fan of my alma mater for that. So yeah, that's a quick run up, but started with basketball, and here I am now researching at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, and I'm researching environmental sustainability communications in the sport industry and what that looks like.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, an avid educational background there from your side. And can you talk a little bit more in detail, because your PhD studies is really interesting on that topic, is such an important one as well.
Yeah, so I'll take you guys kind of back to where that started. I was very fortunate that my bachelor's degree in the US at Regis University was very focused, and this was I started there in 2014. It was already back then a very big focus on environmentalism, really, and the environment. Now that's very particular perhaps to Colorado, and there's this closeness to nature there. We were just at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. We did a lot of outdoors work and outdoor stuff actually in my bachelor's. There was a mandatory environmental studies course for all bachelor students. Quite interesting. So already there, I became very aware of just the climate impacts and everything that was currently happening to our environment. Of course, unfortunately the shortening of the skiing season. I'm an avid skier, big powder hound. And back then is where that awareness instigated for me. And then actually it was when I was at Loughborough University. I was invited to represent the university at the Sports Pro Hackathon. And through that, started listening to lots of podcasts with Dr. Maddie Orr on climate impacts and climate vulnerability in sports, and started to really understand that connection between sport and climate. So I binged in a month. I binged anything and everything I could find that Maddie Orr had been on, and really anything else on environmental sustainability in sport. And a few months later, I was suggested to apply for a PhD position at Loughborough, London. Unfortunately, I ended up not taking that position. It just didn't work out just with life. But then a similar position was open here at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences a couple of months later. This was in 2022, 23. And I was actually able to shape my own PhD project. So at the time, I knew I really wanted to look at this connection between sport and the environment and these impact, the interconnectedness there. And always had a very big interest in marketing and just how good marketers are at communicating and engaging consumers, and how marketers get us to buy things that we didn't really know what we needed or wanted. And so it was through that I started understanding and learning more about greenwashing and environmental sustainability communication specifically. So I was kind of fortunate that I was in a position to shape my own PhD project, both originally with the position that was open at Loughborough, and then take that with me to the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences and continue to develop that. And through that came a research project that now looks at environmental sustainability communication in the sport industry, that raises the question of how sport organizations, now particularly like for-profit big organizations, how they should communicate about environmental sustainability in an ethical way, so that we're not misleading consumers, that unfortunately, sport marketers can be quite good at, or marketers in general. So that's kind of how that project came to be. It was through a very early interest in the connection with sport and the environment. And then greenwashing just honestly being very much in the wind and wanting to take that and run with it, because it's very current and pressing, and we'll see a lot of impacts on these ethical sustainability communication trends going forward, I'm foreshadowing. And so I was just fortunate that I could kind of hop on that early and take it and shape it. So yeah, obviously there will be, stay tuned for more research now coming out, but that's kind of how that project came to be.
Interesting, and I will stay tuned for sure. And you mentioned greenwashing there a couple of times. So can you just break down the that word or words for those who might not know what that means exactly?
Yeah, so greenwashing started becoming a term that was used in the 1990s, typically in corporate language, and looking at what big corporations that were trying to engage a platform of corporate social responsibility, what they were doing to communicate sustainability initiatives, typically then environmental sustainability initiatives. So it started with this trend of big corporations having pressure from external stakeholders. So it could be businesses or it could be consumers that wanted to see these corporations not just push for obviously making their profits, but actually taking responsibility outside of return of investment and making profits. So it started out as something that corporations just felt they needed to do, that is communicate about the environment, making sure that they didn't have excessive emissions and that they weren't using toxics in their production lines and so forth. And the same way that they weren't harming local populations or people or animals in that sense, to our natural environments in their production. And it started actually then as something that just felt as an obligation for a lot of corporations to take on this environmental sustainability platform, if you will, and communicate about that. Typically then in CRS reports, that's where it was isolated to. But there was then this misalignment between this CSR communicating about green initiatives or what these firms were doing for the environment, and then what was actually happening. So this misalignment between then environmental sustainability action, really lack thereof, but then really big communication about it, and kind of just boasting and promoting this green profile, that is then what became labeled as greenwashing. Now, so that's the long history of where it kind of came from, but it was originally coined in, I believe it was 1989 by Jay Westerweld, who's an environmentalist. And he He was in a hotel room or in a hotel and saw this little note about encouraging hotel guests to reuse their towels. And while this note was targeted and saying that, hey, you should reuse your towels because it's good for the environment, he kind of looked past that and realized this is the hotel's efforts of trying to reduce costs of laundry and costs of staff having to do this laundry. So if they can get the guests and visitors to reuse their towels more times, then they're reducing costs. So he looked at this as greenwashing because they were using this claim that, hey, take care of the environment, use less water, make sure you're reusing your towels, don't be wasteful as a consumer. But really, it was just the business way of reducing costs. So that was the original or the initial way that we looked at greenwashing, was this misleading of consumers. In this case, encouraging allegedly environmental sustainability behavior, but businesses, or in this case, the hotel industry, benefiting of this behavior, this sustainability behavior, in a very different way than what the consumer believes they're engaging with. So the key here with greenwashing is this misleading of consumers in very often in a non-ethical way. And of course, and I'm sure we'll get into it later, there is, of course, both intentional and unintentional greenwashing. So some organizations, of course, mean well in what they communicate, but others, there's a clear agenda that it's easier to communicate environmental sustainability, and it's kind of an expectation. So they just do that rather than actually engaging in genuine environmental sustainability efforts.
Hmm. But cannot two things be true at once? It can be good for the environment and for the hotel's finances in this case. Does that necessarily mean that it's bad to have this type of marketing or communication?
That's a really great question. And I would say, yes, I agree. And the way that now in more modern times, companies is using this and leveraging this to investors and stakeholders is they're using the triple bottom line terms. And the triple bottom line is people, planet, and profit. So through this triple bottom line ideology, you can, as a business, you can exist and you can make a profit selling your product or service or whatever it is. But at the same time, take care of people, or like the social aspects of the business and beyond. And thirdly, also make sure you're taking care of the planet or the environment in terms of reducing your impacts and again back to emissions and any kind, that what that looks like. So it's for modern day businesses, we're talking more about the triple bottom line or ESG, environmental, social, and government aspects. So yes, you can do both. Or in this case, what triple bottom line kind of says is you can do all three. And that is what's becoming now the more modern organizations and corporations we're seeing. They're really hammering down on this triple bottom line to justify that it's okay to make a profit because we are also mindful of the natural environment, of people and our surroundings. So yes, you can do both, but it just, in this case, the way Jay Westerweld interpreted back then was that they weren't being transparent about what the intentions were. So in that case, that note in the hotel rooms back in the day, perhaps, or still today, should say, we want to reduce costs of laundry and staff, and we also care about reducing water usage and taking care of the environment. So help us do both. Now, consumers might be less interested in making sure that the hotel industry and hotels are saving costs on staff and having less staff. Hotel guests might not be that interested in that. So it just depends on how effective that message would be to the consumer, I would say.
I understand.
Yeah.
So there are also some like buzzwords, I would say, around the communication and marketing for sustainable efforts. So for example, carbon neutral or carbon zero, net zero. How are these considered greenwashing as well? And what would be a better term to explain these type of actions?
Yes. So they are absolutely buzzword in the sense that that's what we're using these days to attract attention. Again, to demonstrate, and I say we, I mean these businesses and corporations or even sports teams, right? they're using these buzzwords to demonstrate that they are with the current shift, or they're in this green transition. So you use things like saying that you're carbon neutral, which quite frankly, we need to stop doing, because nothing can actually, by definition, be carbon neutral. Considering that everything around us exists of carbon atoms, nothing can be carbon zero or carbon neutral. So carbon is here, carbon exists, we can't get rid of it. But of course, we could talk about trying to reduce the overall emissions of a company. But yeah, so looking at these buzzwords, eco-friendly, green, pro-planet, all of those, just using those words without any substantiated action that can be traced to you actually measuring and reporting on your environmental sustainability initiatives, that is greenwashing. So yes, these terms, just using them and throwing them around, which unfortunately is what's happening a lot today, that is in many ways greenwashing.
Hmm. So the organizations use these words, I assume, because they can. There is no big legislation around it. So how can we embed the sustainability into the sports governance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, and a good statement for that matter. So they're using this language and these buzzwords because they can. Because like with anything that's a new trend, and being green is a new trend, in the same way that adopting and using the pride symbol and the pride logo every year in June during Pride Month, that's also, unfortunately, for many companies, it's just a trend. And they're actually not doing anything substantial outside of throwing up that LGBTQIA flag that month. It's the same way with the green stuff. So right now, this is all guided and based on trying to recommend best practices, and the organizations that have sustainability staff that are aware and educated, they're arguably doing a little better job here and there, because they can kind of hold the reins on what communication, what's happening with an organization, and what words do we use. But there are really no guidelines, no directives yet. It's just there's a myriad of suggestions out there, and someone working in marketing in a sport business could go online and Google like what's ethical and transparent and what's okay to say. But I do believe that actual strict guidelines and regulations, considering this has to do with climate change and quite frankly, like the future generations and the livelihood of our planet. So this is quite serious. And so with that, I believe that it would be right to impose some stricter guidelines and regulations. Now, in the US, it's the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, that regulates claims, environmental sustainability claims that are substantiated. So they will take businesses, including sports. Nike and Adidas have been in court many times now. They will take them to court case by case if situations of unethical marketing on the green spectrum, if that's detected. But it's seeming like in the US there won't be a law that's going to regulate greenwashing, but the FTC will continue, and they're supposed to now update a new guideline, if you will. Now in 2024, it's been projected. The last one's from 2012, so it's been some time. But they're projected to update just guidelines on how to do ethical green marketing. They're supposed to update that now in 2024. And the same thing is happening in Europe now with countries in the European Union. So there is a new green claims directive that's going to be put into play or in action now. And it's looking like at the end of, I believe it's 2025. I could be wrong. It might be 2026 actually, so don't quote me. But in the same way, that's actually going to halt the use of buzzwords. That means that organizations can't use things like eco-friendly on their product labels, or just say that their organization is eco-friendly. You can't use things like pro-environment or good for the environment, because it's really difficult to substantiate, to demonstrate that those claims are true and real. And it would require a lot of really detailed reporting and counting of your emissions, and organizations, honestly, like most aren't there yet. So what that's going to do then, specifically then in the European Union, is probably put a big fat halt to all green language. But that's probably just going to be a little while before they figure out ways to communicate. And we don't know yet, and research doesn't tell us if that means that they will just invent other words, or does it mean that they will actually become more ethically inclined in the ways that they communicate about environment sustainability. We don't know yet, and the research isn't saying anything yet, because that research still would have to be produced and someone would have to look at that. But to answer this question then about like these buzzwords, there definitely needs to be either, of course, more education and raising more awareness, but perhaps also some guardrails on what you can or shouldn't say, and like what's borderline or what's okay, essentially.
Yeah. So we are getting closer to the Paris 2024 games, and you talked about the people, planet, and last one, profit. Sorry, thank you. People, planet, profit. So they will be the first gender equal Olympic Games. So they have taken the people part of the sustainability in the games.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I was speaking to Åsa from the Swedish Olympic Committee, and we talked about that Sweden did not win the 2030 election, and that France might have to build ice rinks in summer cities and so forth. So how do you see that these mega events like the Olympics, FIFA World Cup, and these should, how good are they at improving their sustainability, and what more can be done?
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize that the nature of the sports mega event, just in and by itself, is never genuinely going to be sustainable. To date, there are, of course, you could argue that sport events that are more sustainable. There's a big difference between hosting a local 5K running event where just participants show up, they run 5 kilometers. There's no, everyone picks up their waste and you leave. You, of course, you're making an impact on the natural environment in which you're running on. And if you traveled to the event by car or, carbon emitting vehicles, but there's, of course, that's a small event. Now, if you look at these sports mega events with all the workings around them, it's not realistic to address them perhaps as sustainable in that sense. But of course, I do appreciate that there's such a heightened awareness and so much scrutiny around the Olympics specifically that they're trying. And this is not an original thought by any means, and there are several researchers that address this, and that is this idea of descaling or downsizing the Olympics. That's a brilliant way to perhaps make them more sustainable, not 100% sustainable, because that's going to be very difficult, not possible, but by downscaling either, of course, the amount of competitors that can be in each sport, or perhaps even, which would be very unfortunate, taking out some sports. It would be possible to downscale. Now, I'm not going to get into the logistics of how do we physically do the descaling. That would be a horrible selection process. But yes, just the thought of, first of all, just building ice rinks in France, or building more ice rinks, and the amount of electricity and water usage needed, the resources needed to sustain an ice rink there. It's challenging. Of course, they have ice rinks in France. Do they need more? Absolutely not. And that's actually the really great thing about the Paris Olympics, is that they have done a phenomenal job of reusing facilities. So to date, there's only one new facility that's been built, and that stands in great comparison to previous Olympics. If you look at the Olympics in Beijing, or I mean, even if we go outside of the Olympics and we look at the World Cup in Qatar, where there was really no event facilities available before that could fill enough spectators for a World Cup, they have done quite a good job with this in Paris, and that does differentiate the Paris Olympics from former Olympics, indeed. But it still doesn't make it sustainable. Of course, you can really promote and talk about that it's a great thing that we've gotten to there being an equal amount of female identifying and male identifying athletes in the Olympics. But again, that just becomes then one little label, something that's really promoted, and they run with that and use that a lot. And then, of course, a lot of other things are then disregarded or not communicated about. So again, it becomes very selective in how we choose to talk about sustainability.
Yeah. So, of course, descaling is one thing, but I mean, everyone can do some things, and I believe sports generally and is really important. And I mean, you do as well, I assume, since you have been involved with sports in a big part of your life. So one thing is like from climate knowledge to climate action. So for us, if we are not the IOC or the FIFA, like us who participate in sport and is around sport, what are some things that we can do to help make it more sustainable?
Yeah, I think that it is what you say. It's this transition from knowledge to action. And I think that our responsibility, one, as people who participate in sport, but in this case, also us as sports managers and people who are now becoming more aware of these matters, of issues around environment, sustainability, but sustainability on the broader spectrum too in sports. I think our biggest responsibility and what we can do is to talk about this. Like, dare to have these hard conversations. Some days I'm exhausted. I have these difficult conversations with people who don't understand and who thinks it's problematic that sport has to take on the responsibility of dealing with environmental sustainability matters. Why should sports communicate about recycling? Like, that's a very common question I get for people who perhaps don't see this the same way. But it's daring to take those and have those conversations. And then, of course, being educated enough to where you can have those conversations. But it's not about lecturing people. It's about making it seem real and impactful and putting it in a context where it seems relevant to them. Of course, I do a lot of times emphasize like thinking of future generations, but also giving people examples of like how they have felt the impacts of climate change in their own lives. Here in Norway, using the example of like that we don't have snow certain areas for skiing, like that gets everyone worked up. So that's an easy example, of course, in this cultural context to use. So I think using context that's relevant for where you are is important. And then also, honestly, just leading as a good role model, like making sure you are actually doing the job of recycling. I know people say, yeah, but it doesn't matter because I'm just one person. I don't believe in that. I think if everyone can actually get to a place where we're really taking care of plastic waste, little things like that, and actually people are mindful of what are you purchasing, what is the goods that I'm purchasing, what is it packaged in? If we can actually become all mindful of that, I honestly believe it's going to make a difference. Now, that being said, that doesn't halt the fact that we're still extracting oil and gas and we're still burning fossil fuels. And quite frankly, that's one of the biggest things that needs to change. And it doesn't help that, and I'll use the example of Norway again, it doesn't help that the Norwegian petrol company, Equinor, which is government owned, it doesn't help that they're of course, they're greenwashing in many ways. It doesn't help that they're really proud and boasting their, I believe it's 1 to 3% investments in renewable energies. It's 1 to 3%. We need that number to be, quite frankly, at the end, it needs to be 100. So it's, of course, also actually putting pressure on local governments, elected officials, and voting. I'll continue to use the Norwegian example. I know it's the same in Sweden, and I know it's happening more and more across Europe now, but it's actually that parties with a green profile, political parties, are getting more public votes and they're getting more positions and more representatives in the House of Representatives. Little things like that in Oslo, for instance, here in Norway, that's helped us reduce the amount of parking spaces in the city center. And by reducing the amount of parking spaces in the city center, people actually can't drive their car when they go into town. People are taking public transportation instead because there is literally nowhere to park. And the more people here, now this is very specific to this city, and Norway and Oslo is unique, but I know it's the same in many other Swedish cities, for instance. The more people you get taking the public transportation, the better air quality we now have in the city center, and the more space we now have for green recreational areas. So it's been an incredible shift that's happened here over the past couple of years, and I know it's happening many other places. And that's honestly just by people voting, people showing up on voting days, going to the polls and voting for a green or progressive party that actually has a developed profile on environmental sustainability initiatives and sustainability initiatives in general, really.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, like the Nordic countries as a rule do a quite good job, I would say, with this if you compare, but like with the public transportation and so forth. But then in the US, I know that it's not so, like they don't have the same type of public transportation as we do here. And of course, you know, it's not always easy, but I believe that everyone can still, you know, do something.
Correct. Yeah, it's very important to emphasize that these conversations and educating people, that's where my answer started there, is that the more we can recognize that these conversations need to be held in cultural, environmentally specific context, I think we can get further. And that means that I won't be enthused by or inspired by the same language or initiatives as someone perhaps in Southeast Asia, someone in New York, someone in Texas. And that, again, if we just look at New York and Texas, it's in the same country, but there's people there that they have very different motivations of why you should make environmental sustainability initiatives. So you have to figure out how to communicate based on context, but we need to educate people. Everyone needs to pull the load, but of course, you recycling alone, yeah, it feels like it's perhaps meaningless at times, but keep doing it honestly, and just because at the end of the day, we're all hypocrites. I fly, but I also recycle, and I don't recycle to feel better, but I also do it to make sure that I can lead us a good example. And now I'm the recycling police in my household and within my friend group, so I make sure everyone recycles if we go on a trip together. As
Yeah.
now I'm using the recycling as an example, but it's just such a simple step. The next one, of course, being actually to try to reduce the amount of red meat you're consuming, considering the carbon impacts and emission impacts of eating red meat. Choosing to buy it somewhere if you can instead of taking your car, switching to an electric car instead of using a gas car or diesel car if possible. Those are all really, really important individual measures that I hope more people will be taking going forward.
Yeah. No, that's great advice for something that every single person can do to help out. Something else that you want to mention, I want to, you know, go through a little bit your career journey, but something else on these topics before we move on.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's like for me, pushing a button when you ask me about these things, and I will talk forever. But I think speaking then directly to someone either interested in going into sport management, someone who's starting out in this, someone who's at the beginning of their career in sports management or in sport marketing, or looking at that, it's making sure you are thoroughly educated on environmental sustainability and the broader spectrums of sustainability, because your job will or should include some of those aspects. And if you come into a new position, you are going to separate yourself as a candidate if you are really educated on those areas. And with that too, then daring to actually speak up and being that person within an organization that dares to say something and push for those changes. Now, of course, it is difficult to be the only person within an organization, which is what's happened a lot with sustainability managers in bigger sport organizations, is that it's just them in an isolated department or in their own office, and then how are they supposed to push for change? But it's a start. So for people who are at the start of their career, make sure you're educated, make sure you're taking environmental sustainability courses, education, make sure you're reading, make sure you're learning, because we need sport managers who are good at this. Otherwise, we can't use the global leverage of sport going forward to really drive this change. So yeah, education is key. That's my last takeaway on that, I'd say.
I like that. So you are a dual athlete. You have played basketball and weightlifting professionally as well. So how did your interest for sports start in the first place?
Yeah, I have been active my whole life. But I did start out as a kid. I was rather chubby. So I was good in football or soccer because I could play a forward and just kick the ball really hard. And I was like running into a brick wall if you ran into me. But then I got really interested in running. So I would run a lot with my parents. And then when I think I was 14 or 15, I realized that this was with basketball, if you stay in the gym and you work a little extra and you work longer than everyone else, you actually become better than them. Um, so I was the first to arrive and the last to leave, and that still stays with me today in sports. I did a lot of horseback riding growing up as well. And when I was 15, it was between, do I keep riding and spend my whole life and my family's money, for that matter, on horseback riding and competing, which is really, really, talk about sustainability, not sustainable in many ways, or do I get a new pair of basketball shoes? And it ended on me getting a new pair of basketball shoes. Worked really hard. This was the summer when I was turning 15 or 16. Was selected for the U16 national team. Fun fact, played for the Norwegian national team with a Swedish passport. So that was fun. Later for the U18s had to change to Norwegian passport naturally. But then played basketball, became my main sport at the age of 15. And then when I was 16, I was going to do an exchange here in the US to continue to play basketball. I went to a boarding school in Connecticut. The purpose was to be a little more challenged with education, but also then to be challenged athletically. And while I was at this boarding school, I was recruited to IMG Academy, which is a massive sports academy that I'm sure many of the listeners have heard of, massive sports academy in Bradenton, Florida, in the US. And I was a student athlete at IMG Academy then for 3 years, and then stayed on an extra year after I was done as a student to work on developing some parts of their actually recruitment for student athletes before I went on to college. But during my time at IMG, and I will just say, it's for anyone who doesn't know what it is, I would say it's a Disney World for athletes. And as a student athlete, it's a one-stop shop for everything performance related, staff, and anything and everything you could dream of to become the best possible version of yourself and as an athlete and beyond. I accredit IMG Academy for the person I am today because of the staff and the people that that I was surrounded with, the values that were ingrained in me, the work ethic, but perhaps also this American and international atmosphere of where it was okay and it was celebrated to be good. I grew up in Norway, and in Scandinavian countries, we have this law of Jante, which is this unwritten law in society that you're not supposed to believe that you're better than anyone or think or say that. Now, this probably makes me sound like I'm not humble and I'm very cocky and not afraid to be good at things, but I realized coming to the US that everyone was good, and you were expected to be good at everything, and you were expected to excel both in sports and as a student, and then in extracurricular activities, in volunteering, engaging in different student leadership roles and so forth. So IMG Academy was a very, very impactful place, and a big starting point. While I was there, I was selected to be a part of a student athlete group that was working with the United Nations on their, at the time, platform for sport and development and peace. Unfortunately, doesn't exist anymore. But at the time, it was again looking at the ways that sport could be utilized as a development tool. So I guess I should have prefaced when I talked about how I got into sports and, sport as a tool for social change, really. It actually that started back at IMG Academy. And there's a whole summer that I was a part of this United Nations program with student athletes from all over the world in different leadership roles. Major impact. But I will say I have been injured quite a bit of time during my athletic career and playing basketball. We trained twice a day, and I've trained twice a day since I was 15. Probably a little earlier than that too. And that is typically, that's a skill session of basketball a day, and then a basketball team practice, and then maybe a strength session as well. Now I have recently retired just a few months ago, but I still actually stick to that routine because I think it helps me stay focused and productive. And I do think that's one of the big skills that sports and basketball particularly has taught me, is actually to be disciplined. And and I'm always amazed at people who haven't done team sports in their life, um, them missing out on the unity, the sportsmanship, the camaraderie, and like this idea of working and solving problems together. I think especially this problem solving skill that you learn from sports and team sports, that I'm very, very grateful for. But yeah, so I was at IMG for many years, and then while I played college basketball at Regis University, which is a Division II school in the Rocky Mountain Athletic Conference, I would still travel back to IMG Academy every summer to train and to coach. So that's where my basketball coaching career kind of took off. And I have been coaching. This was back when I was 19. Now I'm 30. Ever since, I have been coaching and involved in some form of either basketball coaching or strength and conditioning coaching. This summer, I'm coaching U18's national team for Norway. Previous years, I've been coaching the U15s and U16s. But in addition to basketball coaching, I also became certified and educated as a strength and conditioning coach. So when I moved to Colorado, I started coaching strength and conditioning at various strength and conditioning businesses and different gyms, essentially, and have been very fortunate to help develop many athletes to reach their national or regional goals, whether it was then specific sports like soccer, basketball, tennis, golf, and track and field, but also I've worked with a lot of Olympic weightlifters. And here's where this Olympic weightlifting comes in. Now, and I'll preface, I was never a professional in Olympic weightlifting, but I did compete at a high level. So the professionalism is purely on the basketball side. But Olympic weightlifting definitely made me a better basketball player. Basketball in no means made me a better Olympic weightlifter. Those two are not directly, they don't directly benefit each other. But I really struggled with Achilles injuries while I was playing college basketball in the US. So after 3 years of playing college basketball, I unfortunately had to take a break. And a couple of months in of just kind of regular gym going, a friend of mine suggested you should try CrossFit. And I said, I don't think my Achilles in my body can do that impact, but I am very interested in getting better at the Olympic lifts, which I had been exposed to throughout my whole basketball career, because that was a very natural part of our strength and conditioning program. So I started Olympic weightlifting at a local weightlifting gym in Colorado. And then that became my new basketball, if you will. At the time, I couldn't play basketball, so I did weightlifting very focused, very intently, and competitively for 4 years, and then made it back to basketball. This was back in 2019, and then now from 2019 to 2024, I've been playing again on the elite level in Norway at the highest professional level. So weightlifting actually was my way back into basketball at the highest level. And there was a major Achilles injury in there, 2 ankle surgeries, and then also a very unfortunate ACL injury. So the comeback to basketball at the highest level, actually, I never thought was going to be possible. And I had multiple doctors telling me that that probably would never happen. But I credit actually Olympic weightlifting very much for making that transition back.
Yeah. Wow, what a career.
Yeah, that was a mouthful.
Yeah, it was so interesting. And I like also how you say that they complement each other. But if we stay on the injury part, so you had a big ACL injury, as you mentioned, and you went and got some stem cells for that, right?
Yes. So I love talking about this, and people are just usually mind boggled when I tell this. So my ACL injury, and I believe the year was 2018. It was a very unfortunate boating accident. So it was in Colorado in the US, tubing, like water tubing, being dragged in a, round tube after a boat. And unfortunately, the driver was driving very recklessly and having a kick out of trying to get us to fly off this tube. And flew off we did. And on impact, hitting the water, probably from a drop of several meters, I hit the water in a really weird way and just felt that something was off in my knee. So the boat stopped and we were getting back on the boat, and I'm in the water just swimming. And I said, my knee is messed up. And I get on the boat and my knee just collapses. And so I immediately knew that, yep, this is an ACL tear. I flew back to Norway because there's some really good ACL surgeons here. And I was set to get ACL surgery here, but I had to wait a couple of weeks for the swelling to go down. Now, in the meanwhile, the restless soul that I am, I didn't want to sit around here in Norway and waiting for this ACL surgery. So I went back to the US to continue working. I was working as a strength and conditioning coach at the time, and I had several athletes who I felt were dependent on me for their development at the time, and who were in a really critical training phase going into some major regional competitions. And so I didn't want to just drop them just because was waiting for an ACL surgery. So I went back to the US, and just by coincidence, it turned out that one of the members at this performance facility was a doctor working in stem cell, working with stem cell surgeries and using stem cells as a treatment method to heal broken ligaments, tendons, muscles, and so forth. So he had a look at my MRI pictures and said, "Hey, I actually think we should try solving this with stem cells." So I talked to the surgeons back here in Norway who said, "You're crazy. There's no research on this. Everything has to be backed by research for doctors to approve something. There's no research. You're just crazy for doing this, but good luck." So I went and got my ACL treatment on this grade 3 torn ACL ligament and MCL. And 3 weeks later was walking fine, still in a brace. 8 weeks later, running, which you do not do on a regular ACL surgery. And a couple of months then later, and I don't think this was more than 5 months later, I was back on the Olympic weightlifting platform, and I was snatching at the time 70 kilos, close to 70 kilos, and clean and jerking 80 kilos plus after this injury. So not big numbers in the sense of where I ended up lifting, but considering 5 months after full ACL tear, that was just insane. Never had any issues with my ACL since, knock on wood. And I think that if I would have had the ACL surgery, I would have never returned to sport. I would have probably struggled the rest of my life with mechanical issues. I speak from experience from having had 2 reconstructed ankle surgeries. So now, of course, stem cell treatment is not easily accessible. It's heavily regulated, and it's not perhaps not even very legal some places. But for anyone who does have access to that, I obviously highly recommend looking into it. And I do also, for sure, 100%, this will be the future of regenerative medicine, and it'll be the way that we're doing surgical repairs in the future, as opposed to inserting cadaver ligaments and cadaver tendons and so forth, or artificial tendons, which is what the custom is today. So for anyone looking at regenerative options for treatments, stem cells is the way to go, I would say.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. And I've heard also like Joe Rogan has been talking about it a lot. And I think his mother was doing something on stem. He sent her to do stem cells as well. And a lot of people swear by it. And it's interesting to hear your story.
Yeah, and in this case, I did a mix of both stem cells, which is then just to clarify for the listeners too, stem cells are cells extracted from your bone marrow in your back in this case, and they can be used. You can actually also use embryonic stem cells, which is definitely not legal in the US or in Europe for that matter. I believe people actually go to the Cayman Islands to do that. So embryonic stem cells is stem cells taken out of embryos, but you can use your own stem cells from your own bone marrow. And stem cells are unspecified cells in the same sense that they can regenerate or shift to becoming the specified cell you need them to be, such as a cell that's a ligament or a tendon. So in this case, when they inject them, the stem cells into a wounded area, in this case in my ACL, what happens is that the stem cell recognizes that, oh, here's something not supposed, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And that stem cell then specifies and becomes tendon structures eventually. I had a mix of stem cells and then also PRP, and PRP is just platelet-rich plasma, which is just using your own blood plates, your own blood. This just extracting your own blood. This is obviously done also in a doctor's office. They spin your blood so that you can separate the viscous, the liquids of your blood, and then the red blood plates. And then they re-inject the red blood plates, which also then in this way are, they're not in the same level, as you will say, as stem cells, but they can still be utilized in a combination. And I know PRP treatments are gaining extensive attention as well. I'm sure your organist talked about that as well, but I get PRP injections in multiple joints several times a year. And it's really making a difference. Stem cells aren't accessible to me here. If I could, I would get stem cells injected in any joint. I could as well, really.
Yeah, I see. So yeah, so if someone is, thinking about it, I think it's important to say that like do your research and do that. I don't know anything about it, but it's very interesting to hear your experience.
Yeah, and I was quite early on. This is 10 years ago. Sorry, no, it's not 10 years ago. It's about 6, 7 years ago now. So a lot has happened in that time, but I'm still in contact with the doctors that did my treatments, and I follow them and their work quite closely. But it is definitely do your research. And if there's any one of the listeners who's ever needs or wants guidance on recommendations on how to go about approaching stem cells for regenerative purposes, I'm happy to share and discuss with them as well.
That's good. So you credited team sports before for many things. So what do you think that you have learned from team sports that you use now in your work and maybe also in your research?
Wow, yeah, it's a really, really good question. What have I learned from team sports? Most definitely collaboration and collaborating with people who you sometimes don't like, but you have to collaborate anyway and figure out a good way to go forward. In sports is all about obviously the next tactic, putting yourself and your teammates in a position where you can score and win the game. And if one person drops the ball, metaphorically, but also literally, you're screwed. So it's that finding out how to collaborate with people who you don't necessarily, for different reasons, you might not align with, but finding common ground. And then I think it's the second thing, and perhaps this is very specific to me, it's that giving up is not, it's not an option. There's always a way, and you can always work harder and try harder. I was never a talent in sports. The reason why I became really good at sports and the reason why I've become an expert in many areas within sports is just because I put a lot of effort and work into it. Now, of course, I have a very big passion and drive and interest, so I think that's a prerequisite. But being willing to spend extra time, in the case of basketball, for me, that was coming earlier and working on skills, staying later and working on skills, getting that extra weight room session in, making sure my conditioning was never, no one should ever question if I was in shape. No one should ever question if I was strong enough. And so in research and in work, to me, that's making sure I'm always prepared, and making sure I'm always willing to do the extra work. And I know there's always going to be people who don't do as much work as me, and I'm okay with that because it still speaks to my character, to my resilience, and wanting to leave a legacy wherever I go. And that's, I think, something that I've specifically learned from team sports is that people will think certain things of you and you will have an impact on different people. So make sure that impact is a good one. Make sure that people remember you for your work ethic, for your positivity, really.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And, nowadays that's not the case every time. Maybe people are getting more comfortable. I don't know, like Dana White from the UFC has this great quote that he says, if you're even remotely a savage, you will run everyone over. Because, as you said, like nothing beats hard work and hard work beats talent. So I think that's really good advice.
Yeah, I've of course always felt that quote very close to my heart, that hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. Um, quite honestly, that is why I am where I am today. And it applies to anything and everything, whether it's if you're still in school and you're studying for a test, whether you're climbing your career ladder, whether you're writing a research paper, which is what I'm doing a lot these days, or reading or preparing a presentation. Put in the work, and it's going to be hard, and it's supposed to be hard. And that's kind of the cool thing about it. If it wasn't hard, everyone would be doing it. And quite frankly, it's 1% that end up becoming elite athletes. And that's because they're okay with the grind. They like the grind. And I think that could be applied to so many different areas. It's that I've just been fortunate that I found that grind through sport, and now I apply it to everything. Really, yeah.
Yeah, totally agree.
Good.
So, injuries apart, has there been any other bumps on the road or challenges in your career? And if so, how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge that I had was actually deciding what specific route within sports to take. So a couple of years ago, I was standing at this crossroads of deciding if I should continue into sport performance work and if I should do my PhD within sport performance, and probably being in a lab looking at muscle fibers, looking at how do we develop faster, stronger, better athletes, or looking at the social and sociological and cultural aspects of sport, which is what I'm now doing in sport management. And I've stood at this crossroads of trying to decide what path do I take many times. And it's actually been a major roadblock earlier in my career, because I wasn't willing to decide on what path to take. So I ended up doing both, or all three, or all four options, whatever that might be. An example will be being a leader of a major student club while at university, while at the same time playing college basketball, but at the same time being a leader working in the wellness and recreation center, while at the same time being a great student. So my point is, trying to be good at all those things, of course, it requires a lot of effort and energy, and I would then have to deselect other things. And I'm happy that I diversified and did so many things so long, because it ended me in the perfect place now at the age of 30. But it was also a roadblock, because perhaps if I would have selected one path earlier, I would have been even better or more skilled or more of an expert already, making a bigger impact and sharing that knowledge even more. I'm sure I will. It'll just take more time. But quite honestly, having so many options has been a roadblock. So I guess out of that comes, for other people and people who are now at the start of their careers, is to really think about, where are you going to be the most happy? Where are you going to make an impact that you feel matters, not an impact that you think is cool or that you think other people perceive as cool. So I think for a long time, I thought it was cool to work in strength conditioning, because now I love coaching, so don't get me wrong, but I thought it was so cool to have that firsthand impact on making other athletes the best that they could be, so that they could go to Olympics, because the Olympics is the highest prestige. And I still think that I would do a really great job if I would have chosen that career path and stayed in strength and conditioning. But who are you doing it for? Are you doing it for yourself, or are you doing it because other people think then you're cool? So I think daring to ask yourself those questions. What are you actually motivated by? And of course, people are motivated by different things. But having check-ins with yourself throughout the year, setting goals for what is your goal this year, what is your 4-year, your quadrennial, if we talk in Olympic terms here, what's your quadrennial goals? What are your goals for the next 4 years, the next 5 years, 8 years, and so forth? I think that's important. Otherwise, you're going to hit more roadblocks. And then I'll say that another roadblock is sometimes biting over more than you can chew, because you want to show that you can do everything. And at one point, which I now have, you have to make a decision, and you have to decide that you're going to be an expert in that one area. but I do credit now being very comfortable where I sit today by doing very many different things in sports early.
Yeah. I think, I think you managed to bake in both the advice and the roadblock in the same answer there. So loving that.
I did.
But I like that also your answer, because you are a specialist, but you're also kind of a generalist because you have a very wide range of knowledge. So
Yeah.
personally, like I would consider myself more a generalist than a specialist in a field. So and I feel like it's, as we said with sport, like you should do many sports growing up to get this diverse knowledge. And I think the same applies for education, that try to keep it as open as possible as long as you can before you start specializing.
Exactly. I very much agree. And yeah, that's why it becomes almost a blessing and a curse. But yeah, it's literally what we say in sports: diversification versus early specialization. If you can keep diversifying, we see that now with a lot of especially track and field athletes coming out of Norway, is that we have this diversification profile or approach, as opposed to specializing kids too early in sports. Stay diverse if you can, as long as possible. It's going to help you.
For sure. Is there something I haven't asked you yet that you feel is important to mention?
No, I mean, I feel like I've obviously, you asked me a question, I talk nonstop. So I do hope that listeners find some sort of coherence and a red thread in this, and that it is informative and interesting, and perhaps that it plants seeds of inspiration for our listeners. I think your questions have been phenomenal, and I feel like you really opened it up so that I could talk about everything.
I'm glad. So I definitely felt like it was a red thread and, a lot of value and on different topics. So the great thing with this also, if there is something you can go back, listen to it again, I will do that, of course, while uploading it. So I've loved this hour plus that we have had so far. The final question that I usually ask is who from your network do you think would be a good guest on this podcast?
Oh, that is a phenomenal question. I think from my network, someone who's working in perhaps similar areas of research than I am, but still looking at different impacts of environmental sustainability in sport. That's Benjamin Mole, who's at Loughborough University in London. He does have a competing podcast to you, although his podcast is only about sustainability.
Yeah.
So I guess
What's it
that's a little
called?
drop for his. It's called Sustaining Sport.
Yeah.
And
That's
I hope I
interesting.
said that right. But his name is Benjamin Mole. He's from South Africa, and incredibly bright, smart. You learn so much by listening to him. Very critical indeed about the impacts of climate in sport and how sport should respond. But definitely opinions worth listening to. So very much recommend having him on if you can.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned the competing podcast. I don't really see it that way. Like I see it as, you can have both. It's like a TV series. If you watch something on Netflix, doesn't mean you can't watch something else. So
no, I guess that's a good point.
Yeah, so like for me, the more the merrier. So I'll be happy to talk to Benjamin and promote his podcast as well. So
Good,
great.
and I'm sure he'll promote yours too.
Yeah, for sure. Great tip. Thank you. Josie, thank you so much for taking the time to be on Sports Management Podcast.
It's been such a pleasure. I really hope the listeners got something out of hearing about this long and odd journey. I hope it can serve as an inspiration in some way.